getting to that place of rest where you trust in the safety of God, where you
Yeah,
trust in the
yeah,
goodness
yeah.
of God, I think is so, so powerful. Welcome back to this awesome Summer Sabbath series. I just cannot say how much I am learning from all of our guests about this. And I hope that it's just giving you confidence that, you can do what works for you. Now, we've got one of our favorites, Wai Jia, Dr. Tam, I call her, from Singapore, who is just a legend. Now, she's a wife, a mother, and is involved in public health. You've got two kids, two girls. Of course, we're both girl mums, so I particularly have a bias toward that. You got, two kids, 6 and 4. That's like, you are hands-on. You're about as hands-on as it gets. Rachel knows a bit what that feels like. She's got four kids under 9. So God bless you all is what I can say. But, a lot of people are wondering, okay, with all that you've done and, you've written a book and you run a not-for-profit and you're involved in public health and, you're getting your family ready to go and live in another country and do medical missions. What does Sabbath look like for you? And dare I say, I've been to Singapore dozens of times and had the privilege of speaking in so many different churches. The pace of life in your own country is very full on, and it's a very performance driven culture, high achieving culture. So it's not like stopping, pausing, resting is not necessarily celebrated. So I would love for you to speak to us from that perspective, what it might look like.
Wow. Thank you so much, Christine. Wow. You are absolutely right. Singapore is like a country on steroids all the time.
Yes.
That's what it is. So God radically changed my idea of Sabbath while I was in Johns Hopkins. It was a 2-year program compressed in 10 months. And Christian people came to me and said, Sabbath will be impossible here. Every minute of your time, you've got to maximize it and hone it because this 10 months in Johns Hopkins is going to change the rest of your life. There's no time for rest for anybody. And I remember I had come to the end of myself about 6 months into the program. Everybody had gotten a capstone project. It's like a final thesis project. And you have to have a mentor, you have to have a project in order to graduate. And I had gone knocking on the doors of almost every professor I could think of to beg for a project. I used to bring my little 5-6 month old or 1 year old child in the afternoons and go from one professor to the next because I would nurse her in between classes, and then I would run from one appointment to the next lecture, to the next seminar, and it was just nuts. And at the end of it, God closed all the doors. And I said, God, this is unfair. I have been faithful to you. Why is everybody getting a great project and I'm getting nothing? It's not fair. And one day God told me, he said, have you been seeking me in your secret place? And I said, God, you don't understand. I have so much to do. And one day I just did something radical. I just told my husband, Cliff, I said, Cliff, I need to spend Sabbath with the Lord. And it was impossible. I was nursing a child that's less than a year old. It was just, in my head, there was just so much to do. We didn't have help. It's not like we had a community supporting us with a child in school and everything. But this is what I did. I literally went into the walk-in closet and I closed it and I said, Cliff, you've got to look after our baby for the next 1 or 2 hours and I'm going to disappear. And sometimes she would cry, she would go wild, she would want only me. And I would just have to tell God, God, I have to trust you. These are my 2 hours with you. And I would go there and really do business with him on my knees. And week after week that happened. Miraculous doors started opening. And within that 3 months, more was accomplished, more was done, more moved forward. Then in the 6 months, I had spent hustling and being in a frenzy and being anxious. And at the end of that year at Johns Hopkins, I graduated with 5 awards and honors. And those couple of awards all came at the end. And I said, God, this is impossible. Who am I? I am nobody. I am nobody. I am the one who brings a baby to class and people are looking at and thinking, what is she doing here? Seriously. And God, you can do so much more. And since then, I think Sabbath has been something that is like sacred because God revealed it to me in such a real and tangible way.
I love how honest you were with God. Like to just say, God, I have a lot to do right now. I don't think you realize what's on my plate, God. You were so honest with him. Is that something new in your walk with him? Is that something you learned during that period? How did you get to be so honest with God?
Wow, I think honesty is the best place to be with God, because every time we hide something from him, guess what? He already knows. But it turns our hearts away from him. So I think I've started to come to God with even my roughest, worst emotions, knowing that I can trust that he is the loving, compassionate God that he says he is. And I've learned that I don't need to be afraid that he would turn his back on me, because God is a safe person to be with.
You know, he is a safe person. I love that, because, and I'm just thinking in light of our series on Sabbath, getting to that place of rest where you trust in the safety of God, where you trust in the goodness of God, I think is so, so powerful. How did you get to that place? You know, we didn't totally go there in the last podcast, but I've been thinking about it. And for you to find this place, like when you're in a medical program and you're at John Hopkins, you know, you're studying, I mean, it doesn't get any higher or more pressure than the situation you were in, obviously. And so to trust God enough to say, okay, you know, I'm going to be on my knees for 2 hours. I have to have this connection point with you and this place of rest in you and trust. Ultimately, that's what you were doing, trusting him. And yet you said when you were in medical school, before the very first time, before you went on the mission field, and I think maybe you got married and then you came back and finished, you said that you were struggling with an eating disorder. Is that what you mentioned in our last podcast? So tell us a little bit about what happened there, and because obviously this situation, now you're many years on, you're doing the program in 10 months, you've got a baby, you've got a husband. So in fact, you've probably got even more pressure going on in your life, because you're married, you've got a child, you're doing a very prestigious program, and you've got to pass, and you're doing 2 years in 10 months. So what was the difference the first time round and the second time round, do you? Or not the second, but when you continued later?
Yeah, I understand. Wow. Thank you, Christine. Wow. I just want to say this to our listeners who are listening in right now. You may not have had an eating disorder, but there is something in your life that is or may be a false idol. And that was what the eating disorder was to me. It was the need for control.
Right.
That everything in my life, my family, there was a crisis that hit, and everything was falling apart. And eating became the one thing I could control and keep away from everybody, including God. And that was what slowly, slowly turned my heart away from him. And so you may not have had that specific struggle, but remember this, our idols look different today than they did in the Bible, like in the Old Testament. They're different, but yet the same, because our idols today are the gym, the studio, the workplace, the office. And what God showed me was that when we release our need for control to him, he can truly, truly heal us and take over. And from there on, lead us step by step into the fullness of who we were meant to be.
So powerful. And the reason I ask that is that sometimes we're not able to enter into a Sabbath rest because of what's going on internally.
Yes.
And it just stuck out to me that I thought, I wonder what the difference is.
I feel led to share this story, if that's okay. You know how we always think of Sabbath as being rest? I think of the idea of Sabbath as a home to abide in. And I'm just going to share this short story, which is, there was once in my life when I had 2 kids, and suddenly we were being evicted from our own rented space. It was COVID. We knew that when the rental had ended, we would go to the mission field. But because of the pandemic that was going on, all the doors were closed, and the landlord said, I'm not going to extend your lease. You're going to have to move and leave. I remember sitting on the kitchen floor weeping, because it was okay when we moved as a couple, but now with 2 little girls, it was different. So I began to sit on the floor, I began to weep, and my little 3-year-old then, she just toddled over to me and she gave me a hug, and she said, Mama, it's going to be okay. I remember this, that at that moment, I felt God tell me, will you come away with me? And it was ridiculous because at that moment, all I wanted to do was just scour property listings on the internet. And I just wanted to do that. We had gone for weeks, Rachel, Christine. We had visited so many homes in preparation for that day, and nothing worked out. And guess what? One day, it was a Tuesday. Cliff said, I'm just going to drive you to the beach. I'm going to drop you there and I'm going to come back. And you're not going to come back until you've done what you need to do with God. And I said, no, I want to do the efficient thing. Just put me in the room at home. And he's like, no, I'm sending you to the beach 40 minutes away. So he dropped me there. And it was through that meandering conversation with God, when time was an indulgent expenditure, that we just tripped over a very seemingly insignificant thing. And it was then that I felt God tell me, do you remember your dream? And I said, what dream? I dreamt that we were visiting a little matchstick apartment, matchstick box apartment, which was $3 million. And God said, what do you remember about the dream? And suddenly it was through that space of rest, of uninterrupted time, where I switched off my phone because my colleagues and my boss were still texting me about the pandemic and what I needed to do in the outbreak. It was that kind of pressure. Yeah. And I'm an outbreak response. You have to be there all the time. But I had said, no, God, this morning, I'm just going to give it to you. And I'm going to switch off my phone. And it is so hard. But it was then that God said, God said, what about the dream? And I had an epiphany and I said, God, it's the wrong housing agent. And in a heartbeat, he deposited the name of the housing agent that I was supposed to contact, which was my dad's housing agent. And when I contacted him, he said this, for the past 4 months, I have been looking for a place for you without you even knowing me. And when he showed us the home that he had picked for us, I wept because it was in the exact same neighborhood that when I had come back from Uganda, I fell in love with, because somebody had allowed us to house sit a home for him. And when I went into the lift, it was the 21st story, the highest story. And I cried because I said, when I was young, I lived on the highest floor. And when I walked into the house, it was an unblocked view of the nature reserve and the sunset that was glowing in the background. And I said, God, through inviting me into Sabbath, inviting me into the place of abiding and the spiritual home with you, you literally led me into a physical rest and a physical home. So this is where we've stayed on up to today. The housing agent said, don't answer whether you can afford it or not. Just tell me, do you like it? I said, I like it. He says, I'm going to take care of the rest. Somebody's going to give this to you. Just sign. No questions asked.
Well, everyone, I don't know where else to end on that Sabbath rest. I hope that has built your faith and inspired you. This is why I love our Propel podcast representing the body of Christ around the world. I know there are so many from every continent listening to this. And for some of you, stories like these are like, wow, I've never heard someone gifting an apartment and believing God in faith. And so I love that we get sisters from all over the world to encourage us and build us up in our own faith. And so that is a way to, really enter into that place of rest, abide in Christ, and, he himself is going to be that place of rest for you. So, you know what, Wai Jia, you've inspired us. I'm going to get a bunch of emails from people going, can we believe God for it's going to be awesome. But, just thank you. Thank you so much for your insight, for your wisdom, for your honesty, and for all of our Propel Leadership Podcast listeners. We just want to say we love you. We appreciate you. Thanks so much for joining us here. And I can't wait to see you back here next week. Thank you so much for joining us today. Make sure to subscribe to this channel to get notified every time a new video is posted. We are so glad that you're here and look forward to seeing you next week. God bless you.